This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. I'm delighted that Professor Anurag Mairal has joined me in this conversation today. Professor Mairal, of course, is at Stanford, where he's Adjunct Professor of Medicine, and he's also Director of Global Outreach at the Center for Biodesign at Stanford University. Professor Mairal, welcome.
Namaste, Hindolji. Lovely to be here.
Lovely to have you. I invited Professor Mairal to have this conversation because it's a particularly critical juncture in the history of the United States and also in the history of the United States and India. And there's another aspect to it which we often forget. Professor Mairal, of course, is part of the Indian diaspora, as it were, in America, the most prosperous, the most well-educated, and indeed the most integrated diaspora, as has been mentioned again and again over the years, in America. And yet, the diaspora in America also stands at a particularly critical juncture. We will discuss all these things with Professor Mairal today. I want to begin, Professor, by asking you, talk to me a little bit about how you see the Trump victory. What were you seeing before the victory actually took place in the mainstream media, which once again seemed to have, in a sense, got it wrong? And what were you seeing on the ground, considering from your vantage point at Stanford, you would have a unique perspective?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on your show and having this conversation. This is such a critical conversation. My role at Stanford Biodesign is global outreach, and I work with innovation programs around the world. And what happens in American politics and American policy does have some role to play in the work that I do, so that impacts me directly as well. But as you correctly put it out, I'm part of a diaspora that's been really growing pretty rapidly in the U.S., not just in number, but also in terms of affluence, in terms of its impact. A large number of companies are started by or run by Indian Americans, and they create jobs. They're in academia, folks like me. They're in arts. There are different fields, and we've had an outsized impact on the society around us, except for politics. But that seems to be changing as well. Frankly, I live in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, which is very liberal. California, in general, is very liberal. So politics here tends to be either left or very left. So what you hear on the ground amongst the people here gives you a sense, but it doesn't give you a full sense of the nation. Fortunately, because of my role, because of some things that I do with nonprofits, I do have engagement with communities around the country. So what I'm going to share is informed by what I'm hearing at Stanford campus, but also what I'm seeing across the nation as well. I think there has been quite a bit of, especially after COVID, there's been quite a bit of dissatisfaction in all age groups. Folks who are employees, who are basically, folks working their daily jobs, folks with families, seniors, and young people, especially the young people. So that's the part I'm most interested in because as a teacher, I see them most closely. I find the young people in the country they feel a bit rudderless. I think pandemic did have an impact on them. I think many of them had shutdowns of schools or colleges. And some of them have graduated in these tough times, and the jobs have not been that easy to come by, even though unemployment figures don't quite show that. So there's been an undercurrent of dissatisfaction for several years now, and that seemed to be bubbling up in a lot of different ways. And the most recent one of which was what we saw on the campuses across the country with the Israel-Palestine conflict and the protests that were going on in the campuses. That was one sort of reflection of it, but it was only one side of it. There were a large number of people who were struggling, not as settled and not as happy about the way things were, but doing so silently or without really expressing it openly. I think that was the context of this election.
I think you said two important points. One, of course, is there's an economic aspect that we should look at, but there is also a socio-cultural aspect. I was looking at the numbers in California because you mentioned California. And one of the things that Elon Musk, in fact, was pointing out today was that even in California, of course, Kamala Harris won, but I think maybe the counting is still going on in the last, bits. But broadly, Kamala Harris won. But even in California, nearly 40%, I think 39 point something percent of the votes cast actually went to Donald Trump. What changed there? What convinced a significant portion, even in California, of voters to actually turn towards Trump?
Yeah, this was a major shift actually. California votes Democratic up and down the ticket, and even when you look at the local races, most of the local races did go to Democratic ticket. But for the presidential election, there seems to be some splitting of the votes, and some votes seem to have gone to Donald Trump. And if you look at the map, the color map, those maps are coming up, and you can see that blue is mostly at the coastline, and rest of California seems to have gone red, multiple counties, and that's a big shift. And I think it's that actually is a really good evidence, and I think the same thing it seems to have happened in New York and other places. All 6 or 7 of the swing states have actually gone Republican. I think it's a really good indication that the entire country was feeling what it was feeling. And every single one of these geographies, these regions, there's been a shift to right, and I consider that to shift to middle. I mean, I'm a moderate, and I feel that nation needs to our nation, the United States, needs to be in the middle. Extremes are really bad for our country. It's bad for the world, and I think we are seeing that shift. Now, why that has happened, that those reasons might be slightly different across different swaths of our geography. But there have been enough number of issues that basically moved even California, reliably blue state has moved to right.
Tell me a little bit about the broad implications of this. For a long time, especially in the first presidential term of Donald Trump, there was a lot of talk about how, the statements he would make would, be outrageous, it would offend a lot of people, and so on and so forth. But especially after the first assassination attempt on him, where the bullet grazed his ear, many people seem to suggest that there was a turn in the rhetoric of Donald Trump. Now, of course, some people would point out to that one rally that he did, which again seemed to have riled a lot of people. But broadly, if you take a cross section of what he was saying, including what he said after he won, there seemed to be a different tempered Trump emerging. And
Yeah.
he's also ditching a lot of the old sort of vanguard with him, with new faces emerging. Vivek Ramaswamy being one. We already mentioned Elon Musk. There was, of course, Tulsi Gabbard. Now, interestingly, both with Gabbard and Vivek Ramaswamy, there's a direct connection, including with JD Vance, a direct connection with India. Now, there seems to be some sort of a tempering of the Trump campaign, so to speak, because really in the Republican Party now, Trump dominates. How do you see that tempering? Do you actually think there is a tempering, or do you think people are misreading something?
No, this is a great question, and I think I would like to make 3 points on about that. So number one is this overall shift that I was talking about a couple of minutes ago. I think that shift has been truly broad-based, not just geographically, but also segments of the society, whether it's Hispanic men, seniors, young people. There's been a big shift, and part of that has been Trump's appeal to all of these different segments, many of which were actually fairly liberal in their approach, in their mindset. So I think there's been a shift to across a large cross sections of our society with a couple of with the exception of maybe one demographic, I think most demographics have moved in the Trump's direction. And a part of that is the approach that Trump has taken in this election. I remember the last election where none of were expecting the win that he had. This election cycle, he was a lot more structured. In fact, there are reports that are clearly saying that he had a very professional campaign team. There was not as much of chaos. They didn't have three different campaign managers to cycle through. There was not as much infighting. And you correctly pointed out, they had technocrats. They had, technically, competent people, innovators, entrepreneurs, industry leaders, actually on the team advising him along the way, and he seems to have listened. And I remember the first debate he had with President Biden, and that was pretty surprising. Our entire household thought that he was much more mellow, and I think President Biden's sort of poor performance actually made that even more contrasting. And I think his rhetoric, with a few exceptions, has been moderate. But of course, things he says can rile people on the left pretty substantially, no matter how he says them, and they can be bothersome. But I feel there's been a real shift in the way he is approached, and certain issues that he's talking about, illegal immigration, that's a national issue. It's a broadly agreed upon issue amongst the electorate, and only in the extreme left or do we see this holding on to that as kind of an issue that that they don't want to brook any interference. But I think generally the nation actually does want to see some rational behavior around immigration, illegal versus legal. So I think you will see some action in some of these issues, which will actually bother on the left side of the country quite a bit. But I think by and large, the nation is aligned with that. Economy is a big issue. Inflation was something that's been bothering a lot of families. It hurt a lot of people. It is somewhat in control now, but I think the impact has been pretty long term, 3 years, 4 years, and I think you'll see a lot of action on that. One thing that's been unique about Trump right from the beginning, and I think it remains so, he's not a traditional Republican, so he's not fiscal conservative in many ways, but he's not a globalist. So it's a new world order as far as American politics is concerned. I think there's a lot more about let's focus on our own needs, and you see this in other countries. You see this in India. You see this, other parts of the world, in Europe and so on, where I think the nations are suffering and they need to strengthen themselves from within. And America has been a bit of a decline for a bit in terms of our manufacturing, in terms of our middle class. So I think those issues they used to be Democrat issues, actually. So I think Trump has taken those on, and I think there is a lot of support for him. So I consider this to be not an extreme agenda from that perspective. There is some concern. I'm in health. So there's some concern about how public health is viewed. There's a major pushback against vaccines and vaccine mandates, which I worry about, because I think you don't want to throw baby with the bathwater. Vaccines have been a remarkable tool for health. I think we do want to make sure that we make evidence-based decisions, but at the same time, things that are being said by, I'm sorry, by potential candidates in Trump's cabinet, look at all potential modalities, look at other ways, like good food is part of health. I mean, that's not extreme, It may scare people because of the vaccine comments, but there are other things that are being said that are not such a bad thing to have in our consideration of our health of our nation and health of the world, and that for that matter.
You said a bunch of things that I want to tackle, Professor Mairal. I want to take the point that you made about health first, and then we'll tackle a few other things, including this entire globalist versus localist sort of debate, and also the other point about illegal immigration that you made. One of the most interesting things that many of us noticed is a lot of constituencies that one would think would immediately be against any sort of checks and balances to immigration, because traditionally they are thought of as benefiting from them, including Hispanic voters and others. Actually, many of the legal immigrants there voted towards Trump because they don't want their own identity getting mixed up, as it were, with a lot of the illegal stuff that's happening. We'll come to that in a bit, but let's talk about health for a moment. Trump's victory came at a point when deep questions are being asked about Pfizer, for instance, on vaccines, right? There's a new book out by Naomi Wolf, which talks about, whether there was adequate testing, or what kind of testing happened before these vaccines were rolled out, what were their impact, and so on and so forth. And I completely agree with you that, to turn anti-vaxxer completely is to turn back, the clock, which is a very bad idea. But surely greater checks and balances in the public, asking for greater checks and balances, is an absolutely kosher thing. Talk to me a little bit about the impact of this debate on the elections.
Yeah, no, this is actually a really tricky and a very important issue, in my opinion. And I think it relates to the approach to science overall. It's not just health. I think we are seeing this with science everywhere, in fact. And US is at the front line of this war, if you will. So I'm going to be fairly blunt and frank about what I'm about to say. I feel science and medicine sometimes is taken as religion. There's almost a faith in science which borders on, I call it scientism. Science evolves, science learns. It is open to debate. It's open to questions. It doesn't go by diktats. And I think public belief and public trust in science and public trust in public health depends heavily on how we communicate science and public health to people. Public health, by definition, is public. It's related to public. So we need to communicate that better. While on one hand, I took vaccines. I took all the doses. Did all the boosters. My family did. And I did that in the absence of full knowledge of what this virus could do. So it was more of a risk mitigation on my part. It's a personal choice that I made. And if you look at the interviews from 2020, my advice was based on that. And the caveat was that we don't know enough. The issuing of the vaccines or commercial launch of the vaccines or making vaccines available to the public during that time was a remarkable decision on two fronts. Number one, it happened very, very quickly. I've never seen vaccines being developed so quickly and being launched. And I think it was probably need of the hour that we moved through regulatory path very quickly. It created new models which could be useful for us for really critical conditions, fast emerging conditions in the future. So that I can say that to be a positive. The process that we went through was not the traditional process. Where we had sufficient evidence and large numbers of patients for efficacy part of it. Safety, we did do some studies on, but it was in some ways need of the hour. I think the flip side, though, I think we should have been open to the public about this. And I think the mandate is where people are struggling the most. I don't think anybody's questioning the fact that we did make vaccines available to people quickly. I think a good majority of people actually are happy about that, and they give credit to the public health community, to the industry, and to the government and President Trump was part of that decision when that happened. And I give him credit for working with the industry and the public health community to bring those vaccines. But I think it's the mandates that was an issue. Like without vaccine shots, you're not going to be allowed to work. In COVID vaccine, I'm talking about. I think that probably was too much, and even if it had validity for some duration, I think we should have backed off of that quickly, and we should have communicated that this is being done in the absence of full data. I think that transparency is what was the issue, and what it did was some people in the society are always against these sort of therapies, these sort of interventions. And there's always a slight anti-vaccine sentiment. Some of it is fueled by misinformation, but I think it's a real thing. It's public actually thinks that way, and I think what happened was when we forced people with those mandates, and we did that for a very long period of time and without being frank and honest about it. Another example I'll give you is of mass. My background is in chemical engineering, so I understand the fluid flow through mass pretty well. N95 versus, regular surgical mask versus cloth masks. And I think very early on, there were a lot of confusing guidelines around masks. Masks, please don't use masks. Masks are not important, not needed. Please use masks, but don't get an N95 mask. Regular masks are fine. And then N95 is what you want to use. I think because public health community didn't have all the data around how the virus actually behaves, and there was not enough studies done on protection that masks may provide. I think in the absence of that, we made these recommendations without being honest with the public, and I think that also seemed to have hurt us. So I think what we need to do is we need to go back to a more informed public health policy making and a more honest and more sort of transparent policy making. We need to earn public's trust back. I remain firmly on the side of science and side of medicine, but not on the side of scientism or something that basically says you got to blindly trust medicine.
That, of course, brings me to the question of public trust that you mentioned multiple times in your last answer, Professor Mairal. Now, this public trust point is deeply embedded at the heart of this globalist versus localist debate that you alluded to a little while ago. Of course, many of us are children of a time when globalization seemed to be the only answer,
Yeah.
in a sort of Tom Friedman, Francis Fukuyama sort of a way. And these were the time when golden arches theories were coming up about how if countries have McDonald's, they don't supposedly go to war against each other. Now, all of this, of course, in the last 20, 30 years, we know is not true. And especially after COVID, the sort of supply chains on which the entire global economy depended proved to be more fragile than had been earlier anticipated. So we then began talking about friendshoring and supply chain resilience and so on and so forth. And we are now at a point, as you correctly point out, where most countries are very worried about what's happening domestically rather than worrying about what kind of power projection or narrative or normative projection they need to do around the world. And the fulcrum of all of this, of course, is America, because as the world's leading military power, leading economy, a lot of the ideas and the norms come from America. Do you think there is in a sense, a shift away from this global Pax Americana sort of idea to a far more, intrinsic questions and doubts and apprehensions about how to fix America's big problems, healthcare, infrastructure, and many other things?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think post Second World War, we have had a shift. There've been three phases, I would say, of how geopolitics and how global order has evolved. There was, of course, the Cold War period. So that was one phase of it where there were two major blocks, and the free world banded together, and sort of tried to fight this evil called communism. And then there's a post Berlin Wall period where globalization just ran amok, and some good that came out of it, but also a lot of challenges that came out of it, and a lot of loss of manufacturing in America happened under that phase. And this seems to be now with President Trump winning the first election, but starting then, there's been an undercurrent of like we need a new world order where we need to look out for ourselves. But I'll actually remind ourselves of East India Company. That was the original globalizer. That was the first major globalizing. I mean, you could go back to Alexander and so on, but it's probably not as effective a campaign where we didn't really happen as globalized world. But East India Company actually created a truly global marketplace, and it was driven by economics. It was driven by commerce. And the globalization that we saw in the last 30 years post Cold War was no different. Let's just be honest. I think it was very colonial. It was very global North driven. It was not necessarily to the benefit of global South, and evidence is plenty. Africa did not improve its MMR and IMR during that time. That substantially it did, but not at the pace that it could have. Even though it had resources, look at what happened with India, and look at what China was able to do despite that, and it actually leveraged that globalization to its advantage, whereas the rest of the global south could not. So I think the new framework where each country is looking to solve its own problems and having this non-interventionist approach outside of its borders, and work with allies to solve global problems, but not necessarily be driven by certain stakeholders, whether it's multinational corporations or Pax Americana, as you said. I think that is probably the need of the hour. Global South is 5 billion people strong. There's BRICS, and there are other mechanisms that are coming up to sort of channel the aspirations of these nations that have been outside of the affluence circle for a long time. And I think there is a need to make space for all of it. Our United Nations as an organization doesn't really make that accommodation right now. So we have a lot that needs to change. And despite Trump's rhetoric and the way he says these things, and he says them for a reason. I think it's not an accident that he says them in provocative ways, because I think you cannot change the status quo. You cannot change the way the world has been working in such a strong and sort of deep state way. You can't change that unless you approach it with a deconstructionist view and deconstructionist language. So I think that's where the future is going. I think that's where most of the world wants to go, is my feeling. There are folks, stakeholders, that don't want that to happen, and ironically, those folks are in the in extreme left. They very interestingly, as well as in on the corporate side, large corporations that like that globalized view. I don't think we should. Last comment I'll very quickly make about this, Hindolji, is that I think world needs to work together. I think my view is that we need distributed power in the world. We need distributed problem solving. We need lots of folks engaged in that, so that it's not top down. It's not telling global south what needs to be done. We need solutions to the problems coming out from these regions, which is partly a big part of my work that I do with health technology innovation. But we do need to work together. We shouldn't put up walls. We should work with each other, but we don't have to have open borders in the way that it has been so far, because it's not worked for underserved communities around the world.
This obviously comes to a point where we must discuss the idea that even if for India, I mean India before liberalization and India today, hundreds of millions of Indians have been pulled out of poverty because of this liberalization process, because of globalization, right? And for even for people like me, I mean, many of us would have never had the jobs we had in India. We'd have probably left India and so on and so forth, had it not been for this opening. But as you correctly point out, many people were left behind. The world was never flat. It was, it always had its creases, it always had its road bumps, and many people actually, were the people who were left behind. I remember reading Pico Iyer from those years, who would always talk about being in an airport, always be on the move, and how everything was becoming similar. And I always thought to myself in those years that, look, this is only happening for a bunch of people. There are vast majorities of people in different countries who are not spending all their time taking from flight to flight, and airport to airport, and airport lounge to airport lounge. I mean, this is obviously not happening for a lot of people. And that, of course, we today know the resentments that grew, and the inequalities and inequities that were built in. I'm really glad you spoke about how we still need to work together, because fundamentally, Professor Mairal, obviously, even though we want to be localist, some of the world's biggest challenges will require cooperation. Let's talk, for instance, even the challenge of climate change. It will require cooperation to get to the point where we want to get to. And one is always worried that in this turn towards localization, we shouldn't forget that this kind of cooperation is very, very needed. However, I think the point that you made about people sort of becoming dependent on the system. A classic example that Donald Trump points out all the time is Europe thinks it doesn't need to invest enough in its military capabilities because America will always be there to foot the bill. This sort of assumption is past sell by date. Is that the sense that's developing in America?
Yeah, indeed. I think there are two elements to it. Number one is America feels that rest of the world, at least Trump side of America feels that rest of the world needs to start solving its own problems. It shouldn't really be looking to America to solve its problem. Frankly, that approach that world took, that dependence on America, served America well. It allowed America to remain an undisputed leader. And in some ways, you could say that a lot of stability in the world came from that, and a lot of economic growth came from that. But as you acknowledge, I think a lot of that prosperity, a lot of that growth did not translate to improvement of lives of billions of people outside of that sphere. Even though hundreds of millions of people in China, in India have emerged out of poverty, billions haven't, right? So I think there is that. So that's one side, issue there, that the world needs to step up and it needs to take responsibility. And then second is that what's the model of development? What's the model of economic and social development that do you want to see? Do we want to see this in a sort of top down, or do you want to see this in ground up? And I think that's a fundamental question in my view. I think where the world seems to be now sort of pivoting, and I think India has a role to play here. India is a thousands of years old society. It has a structure. It actually did a lot of things from the ground up. I mean, gurukuls and local economies, and that happened in Europe as well post Newton. You saw these communities empowered, capable of making their own decisions. There was local governance, there was a local health, there was local education. There might have been a global architecture in India. They might have had for example, a broader definition of how do you do education, what do you teach, So I think that new model that needs to evolve is maybe there needs to be a global architecture especially for problems like climate change and global health and energy crisis that's global in nature. I think you do want to have a global architecture for those kind of things, but the manifestation of that global architecture has to be local. It has to take local needs, local constraints, and local aspirations into account. And I think we need to make local communities part of the problem solving. If we tell a local community in rural Uttar Pradesh, climate change is a bad thing, and you got to do X, Y, and Z things, and it's completely out of context for that community, you're not going to get the long-term impact and long-term engagement that you're seeking. So I think that's the second piece of it.
I have one sub question to this before we move on to the next topic, Professor, which is that, some people might say, and you alluded to this in your answer, that actually this globalization and dependence on America, which Trump criticizes today, actually in some senses served America really well. It is the reason why the American currency, for example, remains the primary currency of the world. It is why America can raise debts worth trillions of dollars and not be bothered until this moment, so to speak, where I think the concern has grown much more. For many, many years, not be bothered because there's always somewhere in the world where demand for this is growing, especially in China and other parts of the world. Now, in a sense, this is contradictory, right? I mean, American establishment does not want an alternative to the dollar emerge, just as an example, right? And yet, it also simultaneously wants greater localization, Europe to take care of its own military needs, Japan to take care of its own military needs, and so on and so forth. There is a contradiction built in this argument, isn't it, Professor?
There is. That's a that's a very insightful question. My read, this is my personal view of Trump's paradigm for America is it's different from the last 30, 40, 50 years of American leadership. It's not driven by we're going to do these things for you guys, and as a result you should listen to me, and if the moment you stop listening to me, I'll stop giving you these things. I think it's more like handouts based approach, if you will. I'm being crude here. I think he would rather lead the world um, based on the national interests that various nations might have. It needs to be based more on value that American partnership might create, and it's more bilateral, if you will, rather than multilateral. If you notice, he always talks about the deal, right? He wants to do the deal, and typically he wants to do the deal with one party. So I think there's a lot more binational lens to it. Again, this is my read, and he would rather would like strike all of these deals, and each nation would engage with America and will depend on America, or sort of will be influenced by America because it's in that nation's self-interest. And he feels that's much more sustainable from that nation's perspective and from that relation's perspective, but also it's more sustainable from American perspective. So America is not footing the bill for all of it and is not being burdened with carrying this entire world forward. And his primary focus is really, I need to make lives of Americans better. America for the Americans and needs to be first. And if I need, XYZ nations to serve the needs of my nation, I'm going to use all the levers that I have to get that. And that's the way I want to lead, and I'll create value for them through that bilateral relationship. I don't know how well that's going to work. I mean, I honestly, this is a new world we are talking about, but at least that seems to be the framework that he has proposed.
Another question that I had for you, Professor, of course, especially because you're a person from the world of medicine. Let's talk a little bit about norm forming as far as America is concerned, because that was the other great role, and we don't talk enough. We talk about the money that America provided and the military support that America provided, but we don't talk enough about this entire norm setting that America did, right? Even in cooperation in medicine, in global medicine, incorporation in global human rights and issues like that,
Yeah.
certain norm setting that America did or the global north did is being dramatically being challenged. Now, in some cases, this challenge is actually accurate because it points out to deep seated institutional hypocrisies and so on and so forth. But as you pointed out with COVID and vaccines, we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. We will still need frameworks, global frameworks, upon which we should really, judge issues like human rights, issues like global health. How do you see this evolving from this point onwards, where there's so much suspicion and mistrust on global North and American norm setting?
Yeah. Yeah, a book of mine just came out which talks about reimagining health, which is going to get formally launched in January, and I talk about this a little bit there. But there's a second book that I'm working on which actually talks about this very topic much more explicitly. You're absolutely right. I think there's a major movement in global health called decolonization of health, and I think there have been a lot of things that have happened in health, in global health in particular, that have been very top down, very global north to global south. Some of it has been helpful. Vaccines is a good example, but some of it has not been as helpful because it didn't take the communities with them. And I've been in global health for a fairly long time, so I feel I can critique my own community, and I think a lot of my colleagues actually agree with that. But at the same time, I think there are a number of things that Global North brings: the technical capacity, the scientific know-how, the frameworks, the standards of care. When I was doing a lot of work in China, actually Chinese hospital leadership actually told me that they really value American companies working with them because it basically brings a certain standard of care, and they're able to improve the standard of care in China as a result of that partnership. And they benefited from that. So they really wanted American companies to be there because but they wanted American companies on their own terms, of course, right? Um, there's a very specific example that I would like to give here on how it's an example of how we could do this so that you know all sides benefit. It's a win-win-win, as they call it. So over the last 17 years, Stanford Biodesign, the center I'm part of at Stanford, has been working with India in training health technology innovators in India. Our view is that we need to train innovators in local communities, and India was our first country that we went to. Now we are in 5, 6 continents. but India was our first country. And we started training innovators in India. AIMS and IT Delhi is when we started. And now across India, there are 11 biodesign programs. There are thousands of innovators that have been trained that actually are coming up with innovative medical technologies, health technologies for India, by Indians, for India's needs. Now, many of those technologies have global south implications. They could actually, because of the business model, because of the cost, because of the nature of these interventions, could be really valuable for the 5 billion people in global south. But Indian companies do not have the heft or wherewithal to really bring these technologies globally. They don't have the commercial force, they do not have know-how in terms of how to bring it out globally. American companies that have been very active in India for a very long time have really served primarily major markets like Mumbai, Kolkata, Delhi, and so on. And over the last couple of decades, they've been trying to get to second tier, third tier cities, and to some success. But it's not been as rapid a shift as I would have liked, as India would have liked. I think this is where I see a potential for partnership between global north, represented by American companies, and global south, represented by Indian innovators, to come together. I have some very specific examples to solve the healthcare needs of India, um, but also create a commercial model that basically allows these large companies to bring something of value to these innovators as they're scaling their interventions, but also benefit commercially from that. And that partnership, US India partnership, that could actually then create a substrate on which you can globally introduce these interventions at a lower cost, at a better business model, a better solutions for that are relevant to these settings. Now, of course, it sounds very Pollyannish, and it sounds very too good to be true, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of wrinkles. But there are enough stakeholders in the US, enough stakeholders in India that believe that there's value in this model, that we are making certain moves. And there is a specific example of this where a company called Medtronic is partnering with a company called Cure.ai on screening patients who might have gotten stroke in remote settings where stroke treatment is not accessible, moving them into stroke care and appropriate interventions that are being provided by technologies developed by companies like Medtronic. Both the companies actually are able to build their product adoption, their penetration, and Indian patients benefit. But ultimately, you could bring that to other parts of the world. So it's a very, very specific example. I went a little deep there, but I wanted to share this as an example of specific ways in which this partnership can work, not just for the two countries, India and the US, but also for the rest of the world. I believe that there is real value in that. And here, we are not really talking about a globalization of the old kind. It's a globalization of a mutual respect, mutual partnership, mutual benefit, and mutual impact.
It's really wonderful, and I hope this is the way globalization proceeds from here on. And now, coming to the last part of our conversation, Professor Mairal, I really want to dig deep into this entire question of the diaspora. You're a member of the Indian diaspora. Now, I remember Devesh Kapoor writing about the other 1%. Indians make up, the Indian diaspora makes up about 1% of the American population, and yet it is really represented in every major business, academic, and other fields. It is highly prosperous, the most educated, the average most wealthy population, and the quote unquote ideal population, because it is so integrated with the American mainstream. One of the things it did not have, though, it had the big CEOs, it had the big academics, it had big scientists, but one of the things it did not have was intervention in mainstream politics, or it had very little of that. That seems to be changing, even as all kinds of issues also crop up, and we have to be honest about this. Look at the Khalistan issue, for instance. In Canada and also in America and other parts of the world, there are of course consistent issues with Islamists and so on and so forth. How do you see the diaspora evolve from here on? Do you think one of the things that the Indian diaspora missed was having a far more active, participatory political voice to make their voice known? And I have to be candid. I'm also, of course, talking about the Hindu Indian diaspora, not just the Indian diaspora. So, this seems to be a missing gap. Do you think that is being addressed? Do you think there's enough awareness about it? What's really going on?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. I frankly, I'm a STEM guy. I've been in engineering and medicine for such a long time, and even though an avid watcher of politics, I've never really sort of delved into these except for the last 2 years. And there's something really significant happened about a year and a half back that shook me to my core, and that's what made me far more active in this space. And I write about this on my Twitter, my X account. And what happened was there was an attack by Khalistanis on Indian consulate, and around the same time there was a bill in the California legislature around SB 403 that basically vilified Hindu American community in California, Indian American community, and basically seemed to suggest that all Indian Americans practice casteism, which is absolutely untrue. And then the casteism is rampant, and we need to have a regulatory solution to a problem which frankly didn't really exist, at least in the way that was being portrayed, and it was based on evidence that was fabricated or faulty at best. And I was willing to actually make the point about it that this is how I started. I started talking about the evidence and how faulty it was, how the sampling was wrong, and that didn't seem to make a difference. None of the politicians actually seemed to be paying attention, and it was passed both in the state senate and state assembly with large margins. That shocked me for a community that has been nothing but a positive presence in this country. For it to be victimized in the manner that it was, it completely shook me off. And the bigger problem for me was that it was going to constrain the space for my kids. My kids were going to be told, my kids don't know what caste they are. We've not had these conversations with them because that's not an issue in the Indian American community, at least to the extent that's been portrayed. And suddenly they will be told you are X caste and you are. In fact, there was a provision in the bill that said they were going to assign castes to people, and suddenly they're going to create divisions in the community, and that really did not work very well with me as an academic, as a professor, as a father. And I started speaking about it. And I realized as I dug into it was that we have done a really poor job. We've done a great job creating jobs. We've done a great job contributing to these companies. We've done a great job in arts and academia, as you correctly pointed out, medicine, 90,000, 100,000 doctors of Indian origin, very highly respected. But we have done nothing in the policymaking space. And none of these politicians, none of these elected officials were willing to listen to this community, which is one of the wealthiest communities in the country, one of the most impactful communities in the country. They wouldn't listen. They shut the door on us. I actually visited many of these lawmakers myself, and I had a blunt comment from them that you're not politically powerful enough. And that made me realize that and this is a criticism of my community in America, that we have believed that just keeping our heads down, doing the work will be enough, and the health and the political system will take care of our needs. We are micro minority, as you correctly pointed out, 1.5%, whatever the percent of the population. We don't have the political numbers. We can't, with the exception of few races, we cannot impact the outcome of an election just based on number of votes that we can provide, maybe through funds and so on. But even there's a limit to that, as we saw with the current presidential election. So what it made me feel was very helpless. And I realized that we need to approach politics and policymaking very differently, and we need to be far more active. And I was not alone. There were lots of people across the US that were seeing it, and there has been a lot more engagement. So we have a Samosa caucus, which has been there for a bit, but in local races, we didn't have as many Indian Americans. In state races, we didn't have as many Indian Americans, but they've started to take a lot more active role, both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democrat. That's been another major shift. It used to be all Democrat. I voted up and down Democrat most of my American life. I now vote by candidates. I actually look at the candidates and they stand for issues that are important to my kids, to my value system, and to what I feel is the direction this country needs to go. And I split my votes based on personnel. And I think that seems to be happening across the US. Indian Americans are becoming more active politically. In the past, Indian Americans would invite politicians to their events and they'll do a photo op. They'll give large amounts of money and they'll do photo op. That's all they were happy with. What I have urged my friends and my Twitter followers, for example, to do is to ask for something in return. Ask for them to be sensitive to our issues, our needs, our unique challenges, and not to be victimized as a micro minority.
This is fascinating because, of course, this is exactly what's happening in the UK too. I mean, I think the Indian community in the UK, after seeing attack after attack, including the Leicester riots and so on and so forth, has become, in a sense, reinvigorated. And I think this is happening to Indian diaspora around the world, which is one of the biggest diaspora populations in the world. Indians are in almost every country around the world, and almost in every country that Indians are there, they play an important positive role in the well-being of the country. Now, my last question to you, Professor.
Can I say something very quickly about that, Hindolji? It's a very
Yes,
important point that you
of
brought.
course, please.
I think the very same reason. So the fact that Indian Americans have done so well around the world, they made such a huge economic impact and societal impact in these countries, also makes them a target. I think there's a bit of fear in the minds of people. So as the world is shifting more to let's close our minds and borders and let's sort of focus on ourselves to a certain extent, I think there is also a fear that these communities are going to come from outside and they're going to take over our jobs, take over our societies, take over our institutions. I think that fear is real, and I think Indian Americans everywhere have to be aware of it, and they need to do all they can to not only make an impact, but also build those bridges to reduce that fear, because Indian Americans are not controlling things. They are contributing and they want to be a positive presence. So I think that fear is real. It may be based on wrong assumptions about Indian American community, but I think the very fact that we are doing so well is also leading to these sort of reactions. Just wanted to mention that.
So glad you mentioned this because, on this very platform a few weeks ago, a very prominent French commentator made this point to me that, in fact, the success of Indian Americans, especially in business, going to the very top of businesses, is beginning to, have an impact both in Europe and in other parts of the world, including in America, of growing apprehension that these talented people will finally replace, a large number of the top positions that are available because of the sheer dint of their intelligence, their hard work, and so on and so forth, which of course causes, all kinds of apprehensions, anxieties, and so on and so forth. Now, I understand the point that you're making, and this is a sort of reverse of the other kind of fear that people have. People are not scared that Indian Americans will flood the streets and create riots or anything like that. But there is also, and we always talk about that, but there is also this sort of relatively new fear that at the very top of the game in many professions, it could be Indian Americans who start to appear and dominate. Even though, as you're saying, none of these people are trying to take control. They're only effective. They're actually very good managers.
Yeah.
They're not trying to take control. But definitely this fear is emerging. So therefore, my last question, Professor Mairal, this is a crossroads, a classic crossroad. Where do you see the Indian American community, especially in America, go? Because the Indians in America are the most affluent among the Indian communities around the world. They are the most prosperous, the most affluent, often the most highly educated, and indeed the most influential. So, among the Indian diasporas around the world, the Indian Americans in America are the most sort of are the beacon. And a lot of what will happen to diasporas around the world, Indian diasporas around the world, will be determined by the turn that Indian Americans take in America. What turn will they take, according to you?
Yeah, I mean, some of it is wishful thinking, and some of it is, I think, the direction that Indian Americans are going. I think Indian Americans are going to become, will never have the numbers to be a political force in terms of the way, let's say, Hispanic Americans are going to be. I think those numbers are much larger, and they have a very different role to play in the American political establishment and in the society in general. I think Indian Americans will continue to play an important role in the industry, in economy, in society, in culture, in academia, in all of these different fields. that require a lot of education. I think that's one. I think the one additional element of that is going to be, as I said, political engagement, policy engagement, shaping the policy for the benefit of all. And another one that I would add to it, and this is the visual part of what's going to happen, I think. I'm part of a nonprofit organization called Seva International, which is a Hindu faith-based nonprofit. It's not a religious organization; it's a faith-based organization. Basically, anchors its work in local communities, hyper-local. I'm on the Bay Area president. We have 48 chapters. We work locally with our partner organizations, some churches, some mosques, some gurudwaras, the local last mile organizations, homeless organizations, and so on, to do a lot of work with the underserved parts of the community. It is deeply anchored in the philosophy of Hindu Dharma, which is Sarve Jana Sukhina Bhavantu, to help everybody, make everybody happy, well, and world is our family. And it's a reflection of those values with this local work that we do. I feel that Indian American community is going to, through whatever faith, whatever backgrounds they might have, they are going to get a lot more engaged. They are, but they're going to get even more engaged with our local communities, especially with the underserved parts of the communities, and is going to create impact that is going to make that community an important partner, part of the fabric of not just the elite part of the society, but also that part of the society that needs a lot of our help. And America has a lot of folks that need a lot of help. I count, tens of millions of people in that category, and our work has been pretty substantial in that community. But I think I see next 20 years that work is going to expand dramatically, and I see a lot of other organizations, a lot of the people in the Indian American community doing that. So I think that's one shift that we're going to see with Indian Americans. And I think it's a model that actually could replicate across other parts of the world. I think we have similar organizations in UK, in Europe. When Ukraine war started, there were Nigerian students who were helped by Seva volunteers in helping them transit out of the border into safe places with food and medicine and supplies, to the extent that Nigerian government actually expressed gratitude to these volunteers. So I think being able to solve these local challenges for the underserved community, people who need help during disasters and other things, I feel that is going to make Indian Americans far more integrated in the fabric of these communities, local communities around the world, and that's going to ultimately bring India closer to these countries. Is my wish, and I think I see evidence of that happening already.
Well, on that very optimistic and gratifying note, Professor Mairal, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks very much for joining me from Stanford rather early in the morning. To have this wonderful conversation with me. Brilliant insights into what's happening not only within U.S. politics, but very importantly within the U.S. Indian diaspora within the U.S. I thank you for your time, Professor Mairal.
Thank you for having me, Hindolji. It's I admire the work that you do. I've watched your shows, and it's a pleasure to be here. Happy to be part of this conversation. Anyway.
Thank you very much. Thank you.